tonight's speaker is Tim Newby. Tim is an author, an educator, writer. His baseball writing includes the volume that is the basis for tonight's talk, the original Louisville Slugger, The Life and Forgotten Times of baseball legend Pete Browning. He is also the author of Leftover Salmon and Bluegrass in Baltimore, two books that are, believe it or not, about music. The bluegrass we can understand. Leftover Salmon is another story that we'll hold off for another time.
Maybe another speaker series.
The book on Browning was a finalist for the Casey Award for the best baseball book of the year. And he is the author of those two books I mentioned, explore music festivals with Bluegrass in Baltimore and other strange festivals of music that salmon somehow becomes very important in. He has contributed to a number of SABR projects, including the One Win Wonders that came out not long ago. His topic tonight is based on his book on Browning, the original Louisville Slugger, The Life and Times of baseball legend Pete Browning. If you, Tim, if you will hit your share screen function.
Yep. All right.
And if you go to can you go to full screen on your slides? There you go. And it's your time. Take it.
All right. Let me get that set. All right. All right. So, well, first off, and I'll say this, and for those who've heard me talk before, full disclosure, I am horrible with the slides. So when you get too tired of looking at me and you realize you look at the same slide too long, somebody give a raise and I'll make sure I move it along. But I'll try and make sure I move those along there, but I tend to get going. Second thing, thank you guys for coming and spending your night tonight with me. I can't think of much better ways than talking about Pete Browning. Hopefully I will be more entertaining than a Rockies game for everyone here. If I am not, I apologize, but hopefully we can get a little better than a 160 win percentage, but no guarantees. Let me fix my view here. I feel my chat screen just went crazy. All right, can you guys see those screens there, the slides? All right.
Everything is fine, Tim. The screen is fine. Tim, you need to unmute.
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay. All right, that was odd. Can you hear me now?
There you go. There you go.
Okay. All right. All right, sorry about that. It's like I've never used technology before. I always think it's a fun place to start with this here, and I can sit here and talk about this all night. This is my daughter at a baseball game recently. As I said, I'm horrible with slides, so I feel if I include this right here, I've satisfied my need to do with slides. And while I could talk about her all night, unfortunately we can't because we're here to talk about Pete Browning. So as we get started with that, let's talk a little bit about Pete. And what I want to do is just maybe kind of talk about who he is a little bit, get us all on the same page. And then what I really want to do is kind of talk about kind of the myth of Pete, right? I think with Pete Browning, there's this myth and this legend, and that's kind of what we all know. So let's kind of start with the facts and figure out who he is, and then we'll kind of get to that. So for those who are unfamiliar, or even if you're unfamiliar, it'll be a bit of a refresher. Pete was born in 1861 in Louisville. He discovers baseball kind of as a young man, and he starts playing in his local neighborhood. He has a health issue, which is going to become kind of a very important part of his life there. He develops what's called mastoiditis as a child. And it's an infection of his ear, and it's going to end up really kind of impacting and dictating a lot of who he is and who he's going to become. And we'll kind of talk about that later on. But basically, it's going to kind of start robbing him of his hearing. It's going to give him severe headaches, vertigo. It's going to cause problem with his eyes. And a lot of who he is and who he's going to become are going to kind of develop off of that. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. As I said, he kind of starts playing baseball as a young man in his neighborhood. He ends up playing on a local team in the area called the Eclipse. The Eclipse was a pretty good team in the area. A number of those players would go on to major league careers themselves. Pete early on established himself as one of the better players on that team there as a young man. As a 16-year-old, he played the Louisville Grays, who were the professional team in Louisville at the time. So he was kind of establishing himself really as a really strong player at the time. In 1882, Louisville was going to start a major league team after the loss of the Grays. And the Eclipse team basically is going to become that team in the American Association, and Pete will make his debut as an 18-year-old in the American Association that year. He will go on to win 3 batting titles over the next 10 years. He will win 2 batting titles in the American Association and a 3rd in the Players League. He will finish in the top 3 for batting 9 times. He'll finish runners-up another 3 times after that. So he had a pretty solid career as far as that goes. And I'm not going to talk a ton about his numbers. I'm sure there's people on here who are much better with that than I am. And we can have a great debate one time, about Pete and his Hall of Fame candidacy over some good tonsil varnish, as people like to say. But we're going to talk about kind of the myth of him here. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along, but we're going to kind of move on from that. The other part of Pete that's kind of really important to know is, and he kind of develops this severe drinking problem. With a lot of Pete, it revolves around baseball, or he always says it revolves around baseball. And there's 2 kind of stories that he claims into how he developed his drinking. One was as a young man, he was pitching. He was playing against some older men, and he was kind of dominating him early in Pete's career. He was a pitcher. And the other team, maybe hopefully to kind of balance things out or to kind of even it out and maybe bring Pete back to reality there, start feeding him drinks or beers in between innings in hopes that would kind of ruin his pitching. The other story is, and maybe the one I feel is a little more commonly heard, is in a game Pete was playing, they placed drinks or beer at third base, and every time a player got a hit and got to third base, they were entitled to a drink. And Pete talked about how he wanted to get to third, and have as many drinks in that foamy mountain as he could there. Whatever it was, Pete's going to quickly discover that drinking is going to do a lot for him. As I said, he has some health issues. He was in a lot of pain. So he's going to kind of discover that the drinking is going to help ease with that. Despite his kind of outward persona, Pete actually also was a fairly shy individual. So Pete's going to discover that his drinking is going to actually kind of satisfy a lot of things. He's definitely going to discover that, it wasn't the love, it wasn't the money, but it was the whiskey that definitely eased the pain. And if you're sitting there thinking, did this dude just drop a Daryl Scott reference? I did. And then if you're thinking, who's Daryl Scott? Go check out It's the Whiskey That Eases the Pain, because it's a pretty amazing song. You should check that out. But we aren't here to talk about music. As Bob said, I do a lot with music, but we're not going to do that tonight. And look at that. I moved my slide along there. So to give you a little background about the book and how I came to do this, like as Bob said, I've done a lot with music. Before we kind of get into this myth here, I tend to kind of like to write about these kind of overlooked, kind of underrated figures. And when I discovered Pete, as a baseball fan, I was familiar with Pete. I was familiar with a little bit of the legend of him. But my wife and I were in Louisville, and we were just touring the Slugger factory, as most people do who go to Louisville. And they were kind of talking about him and telling stories about him. And my wife, who always has a really good antenna for stories and things that, I should probably write about, was kind of nudging me the whole time, this guy sounds super interesting. So that night, I remember at dinner, we were just sitting at dinner, having a drink. We were kind of just looking up stuff on our phones casually about Pete. And I kind of remember thinking, there's a lot about this guy. I wonder why there's not a whole lot, why there's not much else there, or what it is about him. So I said, well, I'm going to take the rest of the summer and just kind of dive in and see. Maybe his story is only this big, right? That's all that it is. Maybe there's no more story, and there's a reason that we don't see a lot out there on him. And as I kind of started digging in, I really kind of started getting really intrigued by this story. There is a lot there. And as I said, I tend to kind of be attracted to these stories of overlooked, kind of under-recognized figures, bands, musicians. And, my other books tend to be about that. I wrote about the history of bluegrass in Baltimore, and I wrote about Leftover Salmon, who is a band from Colorado. And they all are hugely influential people and bands and scenes, but they're often overlooked. And I kind of started seeing Pete in the same light. He's this overlooked, kind of under-recognized person. And we know a little bit about him, but what is the story there? So that is what really intrigued me the most to start diving in. So I kind of dove in and decided that this is what I want to take on. And I really became captivated by his story. So with that, I obviously started kind of researching and writing the book. And as I was doing that, I realized there's really 2 interesting kind of things or avenues about Pete, right? There's the surface area that we know and what everybody knows is, and kind of what I just laid out, right? He was a really good hitter. He's kind of overlooked. He's recognized with this connection with Louisville Slugger, which we can talk about a little bit later. And there's the myth of Pete, right? This crazy guy who did all these eccentric things, and he drank, and there's stories about his drinking and how excessive he was with his drinking, and he talked to his bats, and he did this, and that myth of it really intrigued me as well. And so what I wanted to figure out is, where's the truth in the myth? Because I think there's so many good stories, beyond just the myth. And I always want to find out, well, we have this myth, and that's generally what we know. And a lot of times that's what we know. That's why history and researching stuff is so interesting, because we know this myth, but we want to find out what's the truth behind there. And that's what I wanted to do. So there's the legend of Pete, and we kind of talked about the basics. And the legend of Pete is he's a very loud, boisterous figure. He was kind of known to live to extremes. He drank hard, he drank often, he drank regularly, he drank a lot. And he was very eccentric, and he did lots and lots of crazy things, or what may seem crazy. He had an obsession with his eyes, or as he called them, his lamps. And he was known to take care of them in very peculiar ways. He would do things like when it was raining, he would walk outside and hold his head up in hopes that the rain would come and wash his eyes out. On the way to games, he would smoke cigarettes, and as he kind of exhaled the smoke, he would hope that it would get into his eyes. He would do things in the morning. He would wake up and he would, pour buttermilk into his eyes. He had this eye care routine that he talked about. I mean, I know some people have a skin care routine. Pete was a little ahead of the curve there. He had an eye care routine. So maybe if there was like a social media TikTok thing, Pete would have been out there being an influencer with his eye care routine. He also claimed that when he was on trains, he would hang his head out the window in hopes that ash or cinder would get into his eyes and help clean them out. I think we can safely say we know that never happened, or else he probably wouldn't be seeing as well as he did. But he had all these kind of crazy kind of things he did. And then he had other things he did too. In the field, he was known to maybe stop balls with his feet, or he stood on one leg, or he talked to bats. And all of this together paints this picture of this really kind of eccentric man. And it was with that where I said, well, is there a reason for that? I mean, look, there's stories of people out there who are just do these peculiar things for no good reason. But I wanted to find out, was there a reason that we could explain for this, that we could at least attempt to explain why Pete did this? And for me, it started coming back to his mastoiditis, this condition he had. So like I said, he developed this ear infection that developed into mastoiditis. At the time, it was a pretty kind of deadly condition. Now it's pretty treatable because we have penicillin. Penicillin wasn't available at the time of Pete's childhood. But so like I said, it starts robbing him of his hearing. It causes problems with his eyes, lots of swelling, lots of pain, vertigo, and headaches. So lots of what Pete does are how he acts. You can start kind of looking back at this condition. Pete is remembered as being illiterate and, uneducated. And yes, he did drop out of school at some point, though it may have not been completely too far from where the end of school would have been from at the time anyway. It appears he wasn't completely illiterate and was happy to kind of play that up, because there is stories of him writing and reading and doing that. And one of the things I'll kind of talk about is, Pete seems to be very aware of his image and was happy to play that up. But a lot of it, the problems with is think about it, if you can't hear, school is going to be a bit difficult. And his hearing loss seemed to start very early on. By the time he was a teenager, it was pretty advanced. I don't believe he was ever completely deaf, because there's enough kind of evidence that he seems to be holding regular conversations, but it definitely was a difficulty. So schooling was an issue for him, which would lead into kind of this idea of, that he can't, hear in class, and he's going to struggle with that. The other side of the hearing is he became this very loud, kind of boisterous person. And I think, again, a lot of that can kind of be related to your hearing. I mean, clearly you're going to talk louder if you can't hear. And he was known to kind of talk a lot about himself. And while, yes, I believe he was a bit cocky there, there's a lot of stories about how shy he was. And I believe a lot of this kind of boisterous nature was him on some level kind of compensating for his lack of hearing. In conversations, he often would struggle. And I think the easiest thing that for anybody to do is, if you're in the midst of a conversation and you can't hear what they're talking about, you just turn the conversation back to the one thing you know the best, and that's you, right? You can just start saying, well, look, I don't know what you're talking about over there, but I am the champion batter of the American Association. And again, I think that's an easy way to maybe explain some of his kind of habits that he had there. I think most interestingly is his name is not Pete, right? His name is Louis Rogers, but he was unable to hear names. And he often, when he kind of met people, would just start calling them Pete and old Pete. And eventually they just gave the nickname to him. So, I think interestingly enough, his hearing is going to lead to him being called the name that we kind of recognize him as. So I also talked about he had all these kind of crazy kind of eye care routines. As we said, Pete was this probably less educated person living in an era of questionable medical practices. So I think we can see a lot of what Pete's doing with these kind of things. If we pause for a second and take out just how peculiar it is and what he's doing, and recognize it for somebody who's trying to solve these issues there. The idea of pouring buttermilk in your eyes sounds pretty absurd. But on one hand, if you go, my eyes hurt, there's a problem there. There may be a soothing nature to that, right? If we think about that instantly, right? And so I think for Pete, he's trying to do that. Now, interestingly enough, I actually talked to an optometrist about that to ask about the benefits of pouring buttermilk in your eyes. And he said he would have been better off drinking it because of the nutrients in it. And he was probably more likely to cause damage because of the bacteria in the buttermilk than that. But I don't think Pete would have been quite aware of all that science at the time. But so I think we can see him trying to kind of maybe ease some of the pain that he has with his eyes, trying to relieve that. And again, it can go to a bit of the extreme, the idea of hanging your head out the window and catching cinder or ash in your eye or something like that. But the idea of rain to wash it out. But it also speaks to how much Pete thought about baseball. And I think that's a part that's forgotten about a little bit too, is Pete's whole life was basically baseball. He didn't have much else. He lived with his mom his whole life. He never was married, never had kids. So baseball kind of was all encompassing for him. And he seemed to think about it a lot. And, we often just think of Pete just being this figure who just walked up to the plate and just swung away wildly and, hit the ball. But he actually put a lot of thought into it. There's plenty of stories. And, if I can. There's all these stories of him kind of, practicing and stuff, but they're not as remembered as much and told as much because they're not as funny. But, there's stories about how he was always out at the field early and practicing his hitting and stuff. So I think it's important to remember when we're talking about some of these things, how much Pete thought about baseball. And with that, he really was putting a lot of care in his eyes. When you think about hitting a baseball, right? Now they're training eyes and they have all kinds of drills where you follow to strengthen your eyes. And not that Pete was necessarily doing that, but he's already recognizing, and with whatever amount of education he has, how important those eyes are to what he does, right? To see a baseball throwing at you, at a high speed, and then to hit it and make a quick decision on there, he's recognizing how important those things are. Now, am I saying that Pete had all these thoughts consciously? No, but he's probably definitely recognizing those on some level. So Pete kind of, again, has these peculiar habits that he has. Now, the other side that we talk about a lot with Pete is some of his peculiar habits in the field and how that leads into kind of some of the myth of Pete. So Pete was regarded as a pretty miserable fielder. I don't think that's entirely true when you kind of look at the numbers, and I said we're not going to look at numbers a whole lot here. His stats don't really make him the worst. He had a couple seasons where he was pretty bad, but he was generally around average, and he's playing in an era, obviously, of like no gloves and stuff like that. And early on in Pete's career, he was playing second and short in those middle infield spots. And I am no defensive wizard in baseball, but I'm pretty sure you don't put your worst defensive player at those positions there. But more what happened is Pete kind of started taking to standing on one leg in the field. And again, just on its surface, that seems utterly absurd. But Pete had been run over a number of times because he struggled to hear base runners approaching. And for him, it was a bit of a defense mechanism. If I stick my leg up here and kind of have my knee sticking out over here, I can possibly help deter that. He also started taking the standing really far back out of the base path. Again, I am no defensive mastermind here, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't really help your defense as well. So some of these kind of wounds that Pete's going to have, so to speak, in his defensive skill is a little self-inflicted. He's eventually going to be moved into the outfield, though he sometimes still continues to stand on that 1 foot. He also seems to be utterly lazy in the outfield, and we can just see that because he's not moving. But the reason he's not moving is he, again, is struggling to hear his teammates who may or may not be calling him off of a fly ball, and it's just much easier to just stand there and let them take it. Pete being Pete with his kind of personality, he also found it much easier, instead of admitting that there was a problem with that, just to say, look, I can go chase that fly ball down, but what good is it going to be if Pete's legs are tired when he gets up to bat? Because, anybody can catch a fly ball, but nobody can hit like Pete. So he kind of took the stand there. But again, there is a reason for that. He also later in his career is going to kind of be criticized for the way he starts handling ground balls. He's going to start using his feet to stop them. And again, odd Pete in the field, just stopping balls with his feet. But again, when we stop and think about it, in the latter half of Pete's career, his mastoiditis seems to be really bothering him. There's a number of times when he misses bunches of games in there. He makes a number of comments about how much the heat is impacting him. He was known to stand if there was shade in the field, he would try and stand there despite what it may be for his defense. And he would tell somebody, "I'm not moving because I can go out there, but it's hot. I'm going to stand here." There's stories of him coming off the field and he had a cabbage leaf in water and he would put it on his head to cool it off. So I think we start taking that, we can see the grounders in a different light. I don't suffer from vertigo. I don't know if anybody does. But I imagine if you have vertigo and you bend over to pick up a ground ball, that's just not going to help things with your head and may lead to you falling over. So I think we can see that in a different light. We start understanding maybe what he was going through. Because I think one side to understand about Pete is he's this kind of really tragic figure as well. It's easy to look at just the surface and the silliness of Pete and kind of these stories, but there's a tragic side too. There's this man who's playing at a really high level, who's battling a drinking problem, which in any other era we recognize as him being an alcoholic, but we didn't have a clear understanding of that then. And at the same time he's battling this health issue, so he's a really tragic figure for a number of reasons. But I think that helps understand a little bit more about kind of Pete and Pete's ability in the field. And I think what also is lost is that if you kind of go back and read through a lot of the game stories of Pete, there was a lot of stories about these amazing plays he did make when he kind of put that effort in. There's a story, somebody talked about how they couldn't believe how it's unfair that they can let somebody like Pete out there because he can leap 6 feet in the air and catch a ball with one hand and do all this. And again, do I think Pete leapt 6 feet in the air? No, but I think that it speaks to how people perceive some of what he could do. So I think a lot of his fielding was a little more self-inflicted and less about being lazy and not being a good fielder, and more deal with him trying to deal with some of these health issues and things that he kind of does have going on. Excuse me. The other area that we talk about Pete a lot with is his drinking. And his drinking was pretty legendary. I mean, in an era of hard drinking men in baseball, Pete definitely was a champion consumer of bourbon there. He drank a lot. Towards the end of his career, he is going to sort of start giving it up. He seems to start getting sober around 1890, though there's still some tales and stories about him getting drunk. But I think even his drinking starts becoming a little bit overblown, a little bit, and maybe become a little mythologized. Two of the kind of more famous stories aren't quite exactly what they seem. So the one is a famous story in 1888. Pete was in Kansas City and he was drunk and he gathered his fishing gear and it had been raining and the gutters out front had filled with water, and Pete sits down and lights a cigar and he's going to go out there and start fishing. He's going to catch his dinner. And that's hysterical, right? This drunk baseball player just out there smoking in the rain, trying to catch his dinner. But that's not really what happened. What had happened was he was going to go fishing, but had passed out on the side of the street, on his way there, and had to be carried back to the hotel. And I think when we hear that, it becomes a little different. It's not just this fun-loving drunk over there. All of a sudden, it's somebody who really does have this real problem with alcohol, who really is an alcoholic. And in a different era, we would understand that, but at that time, we didn't have as good understanding. The other story is maybe the most famous quote kind of attributed to Pete. And he, any story you read always says, "I can't hit until I hit the bottle." And to me, that always sounds like this very this kind of cavalier guy. I'm about to go up and hit, but hold on, let me grab my drink and I'm going to throw one down and I'm going to step up there and boom, I'm going to crush one now. But that's not what he said, actually. In that same 1888 season, Pete had signed a temperance pledge at the beginning of the year saying he wasn't going to drink. Much of his team had. Pete often at the beginning of the season would say he wasn't going to drink, and that only lasted so long. To start the season, Pete was in a bit of a slump, and he was talking with a friend at one time, and he said to them, "You know what? I think I'm going to have to start drinking again so that I can hit." And while it seems minor, here's somebody who, as we talked about earlier, was pretty talented and worked at that and had this skill. But he's equating the fact that he's not drinking to how well he's doing on the field. And I think that becomes a really sad, tragic narrative when we think about him. And that, to me, speaks a lot more to kind of this story. It's easy to see that headline and tell that's just that story and go, this guy had to get drunk and play, and he went out there and still hit 350 and 400 and 371 and all that he did. But that's not what he said. He said, "I think I'm going to have to start drinking so that I can hit." And I think it's again, really sad to think about that, to think about this man who has to equate that idea to, his drinking and his hitting there. And so I think kind of maybe the final legend of Pete is maybe the biggest one and the one that maybe we deserve to talk about kind of the most. And that's Pete's connection to Louisville Slugger. So the myth and we'll kind of make sure everybody's on the same page. That is, in 1884, Pete was in the midst of a slump. He breaks his bat. He's approached by Bud Hillerick, who is the son of J.F. Hillerick, who owns the Hillerick Woodworking Company, a local wood company in Louisville. They were not a bat company. They were making buttered churns and chair legs and stale rails and things like that. Bud approaches his hero and says, "Hey, I can help you repair that broken bat that you just broke. Let's go back to the shop." And at night, under the cover of darkness, because Bud didn't want his dad knowing, because his dad was against using the lathes for baseball because of, the reputation of baseball with gambling and drink at the time. So Bud and Pete at night go in there, and Pete, standing over Bud's shoulder, gives him directions and instructions to make a bat. And Bud makes this bat. And the next day, Pete goes out, and goes 4 for 4, and the legend of the Louisville Slugger is born. Well, did that happen, and how did it happen? And is that the story there? So I'll say this to start with, and then we'll kind of move through. All right. Did Pete have a bat made there? Yes, I 100% believe he did. Is he the first person to have a bat there? I think probably likely not. Is he the first prominent professional to have a custom-made bat there? I think that's more likely. Is he the one who's going to help popularize it? Yeah, I think 100%. So one of the arguments at the time is there was no evidence in 1884 of this happening. Well, and to me, that's proof that it did happen almost. I don't know why, if the story is as told, that Bud, a 17-year-old at the time, would be willing to advertise that he went against his dad's wishes and did something he didn't want him to do. For Pete was known to be really into bats and pay attention to bats and get bats wherever he could. In 1884, it was just the case of him going out and getting a bat made by somebody to replace a bat he broke. Now, the other side of that is in 1884, there's no real instances of Pete going 4 for 4 following any kind of slump. And in May, when sometimes this story is said to happen, his improvement seems to happen more with some surgery he had. So I think that part of the myth maybe develops later on. But it does seem that Pete was getting bats made there. And there's enough proof, or at least I believe there's enough proof of that throughout the rest of Pete's career and into his life. Now, one of the things that's going to start casting doubt on this is later on, there's going to be people who are going to make different claims. So Arlie Latham, most famously, is going to claim that he had the first bat there. But before we get to Arlie in 1939, let's talk about what we have leading up to that. So later in Pete's career, there is some articles and some references, especially when he's playing in Pittsburgh, to him getting crates of bats delivered from a company that was making bats for him back home. Now, that company is unnamed, and so I think we can all say it could be somebody else. But with the number of references that start happening there, I think it's also a very good guess that we can say it is that company. Pete was known to order bats for many of his teammates on the Pittsburgh team, and he would kind of distribute them, and he kind of always would be so happy when these bats would come. There's a few more references kind of throughout his career with that. In 1903, in St. Louis, there's an article, and it's kind of talking about Pete Browning, and it's talking about this firm back in Louisville that kind of made all his bats that he did his damage with. Now, again, the firm is unnamed, but again, Hiller Company was starting to make bats now already at this time. And again, none of my research could I find another bat company at the time, so I think it's a pretty safe assumption to say that there is some connection there, and Pete was kind of helping to spread that word. The kind of legend of Pete, it seems to evolve a little bit later. In 1909, there's an article that came out in a Boston newspaper, and it tells the story of the Louisville Slugger, but it leaves Pete out of it. But it tells the whole Hillage story. A player broke his bat, and Bud approaches him, but it leaves Pete out. So that kind of maybe seems where that myth a little bit first starts. After that, there's some other stories where it seems that the story is told where Bud actually didn't make him a bat. He scratched a circle on his bat to give him a home run. There is a couple instances of Pete hitting some pretty grand home runs in 1884. But again, nothing that really followed any kind of like notable slump. In J.F. Hiller, the father's obituary, is the first time we actually see the story laid out with Pete and a Hiller. But in this case, interestingly enough, it's J.F. who did the turning. So the father, who in the original myth was against it, in his obituary is placed as the one who had done it. And he tells a story that Pete came in and he said, "I'm so busy." But Pete said, "Well, I'll buy everybody dinner, but let's just make sure we get this done." It seems after that, that's when we really see the story take hold. There's some articles in some New York newspapers over the next few years that lay that story out kind of pretty much the same way. They change the number of Pete's that Hit has. There's another article which I think carries a little more weight in the 20s where there was some baseball dignitaries, players, coaches, managers who were visiting the Hillerich and Badgley company, and they kind of give the history of the company, and the history of the company they give is Pete having this custom-made bat there. And they are very clear in saying that it was a custom-made bat there, having that made there. There was also a number of advertisements at the time that kind of start talking about Pete being the first and that. So we see that connection with Pete in the first really starting to come in there. And it seems kind of odd that we would have this connection to somebody who had died in 1905 and who by this point had been retired now for nearly 25 years at that point. And while maybe was still kind of memorable, wasn't so memorable that we're talking about. So it's interesting that we're still kind of connecting with him there. The real question starts coming a little bit later as we see Arlie Latham. There's an article a little later where he makes claim to this. And the interesting thing is his story is almost exactly as Pete's. A bit of a speculation on my part is Pete and Arlie were teammates, and there seems to be a lot of evidence the two of them did not get along. So, is this a bit of Arlie maybe trying to get back at his, kind of long-lost teammate who he didn't like a lot there? His story gains a little bit of credence when Bud kind of writes a letter kind of confirming that. It seems to be that may have been a little bit more of kind of a wink and a nod towards Arlie, because there were other instances of Bud kind of saying, yes, that this had happened and this is what had happened. There was also an interesting article during World War II, because the Hillerich and Badgley company was helping to create stocks, like gun stocks to help the war effort. And they kind of talk about this model 1887 Pete Browning bat that they had kind of made and they still had there and was imprinted with that. So can I say that Pete was the first there? I don't know if I can say that. I think that there was more than likely what it was is Bud, who played local, minor league, semi-pro, whatever it was, baseball there, was making bats. Other players, Gus Wiring in particular, may have had some of these bats, and Pete more than likely was familiar or knew that they could make bats there. I think it's a better thing to say that Pete went there knowing he could get a bat made there and gets a custom-made bat, and then he becomes the one to kind of help popularize and getting the bats, and then that's where that kind of legend is born there. But I think, to me, that's a bigger part of the story and how we can kind of look at it that way. I think, and this is what kind of becomes interesting with Pete, and what I kind of always am fascinated with a lot of these players of 19th century baseball and many other history, is that while we can sit here and we can kind of look at these stories, like for Pete, at least for me, right, he's going to kind of still always be this, mythological figure here, right? We can talk about this, and I myself went through and feel that I have an understanding of who he is, but at the end of the day, like, we still don't kind of always know. And again, Bob kind of said a bunch of times that music is what I write about, and I equate a lot back to that. And so I kind of equate him to like those legendary rock musicians who died at 27, right? Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin and Kurt Cobain, and Otis Redding was 26, but we'll lump him in there because I love Otis. But all those people like that, because they are always going to be legendary because they're never going to release a bad album. Now, Pete released some bad albums in his time, right? The 1889 season was a pretty bad album. But the point is, Pete's going to always be this mythological character because we aren't still going to always know that. And it's easier to kind of build up the myth of who he is. And I think that's what makes all these kind of people interesting. So I kind of always like to kind of close with this, if you guys don't mind. Pete's legacy and his place in the history of baseball are complicated. They're not considered a progressive innovator when it comes to the evolution of the game. Pete must be remembered for his role in the development of the Louisville Slugger and the modern bat. His meticulous attention to his bats, the all-important tools of his trade, helped other players recognize their importance. Bats evolved into highly specialized tools, crafted and designed for the unique needs of each individual player. Pete's drinking and habitual disregard for the rules are regular points of discussion, as is his endless stream of unconventional and quirky behavior. He was not as overtly rebellious as Doc Ellis, who pitched a no-hitter while on LSD, or as defiant as Curt Flood, whose stubborn opposition to the reserve call helped change the game. Pete's behavior was more akin to the off-the-wall actions and antics of Detroit Tigers pitcher Mark Fitterich, who was known to talk to the ball, manicure the mound, and throw balls back if he believed they still had hits in them. Pete's outlandish life and unconventional approach to the game paved the way for the rebels and rule breakers that followed. He was also a uniquely talented individual who had baseball better than almost everyone in the early years of the game, and whose skills separated him from most other players of his generation. His decade of hitting excellence ranks him among the all-time best. Pete is often defined by his era, a time of rule changes and advances in the game. He, in turn, helped define that era. In 1903, Pete commented on the state of the game and compared it to his generation. There ain't three men in the country today that can play ball like we used to. There ain't no stick work, and the game ain't a bit heady. Why, if 9 of the old boys, as they was in their prime, would go to bat now, and one of these modern teams was in the field, they wouldn't get us out for a week. Then in his own unique way, he addressed his own legacy. Mind, I ain't saying that old Pete was out of sight, but there ain't nobody in the country that knows more about the game than I do. The perception of Pete's life and career has often been guided by the adage, when forced to choose between the truth and the legend, choose the legend. All legends involve myths, and myths are at best half-truths. There is a fine line between fact and fiction. Pete straddled that line his entire life. He is a contradiction and an enigma. He is a generational hitter whose skills have long been overlooked. He is the champion batter of the American Association. He is the Prince of Bourbon. He is the old warhorse and the gladiator. He is the Louisville Slugger. He is immortal. He is a legend. He is all those things. He is Pete Browning. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. If you would close your slides. There you go. And just X out. There you go. Good. Everybody, if you wish to, I don't see anything in the comments page, but if you got a question, go ahead and turn your microphone on and let's address some questions to Tim.
Nothing. And I'm here. You guys ask me anything.
I have a little different reading of the original Slugger. There was a 1914 rotogravure section in a Sunday paper in the Louisville Commercial, and I can remember sitting in Jack Hilrich's office talking to him about something, and he said, Pete Browning got the first bat, and I behind him was this rotogravure section framed. And I said, well, Jack, you need to turn around. That's not what your grandfather said. Because he wasn't sure who got the first one, because he made bats for his friends and whatnot. Weighing is listed in there as possibly being the first one. But Bud Hillick was also known to tell stories. But
I think that's fair to say. I think that it's hard to say Pete had the first. I think Pete needs to be recognized for maybe being the most prominent and then continuing to do it. And, he definitely seemed to help popularize it. I mean, more than Gus Waring would have. And yeah. I think it's hard to say who the first was. And, but I think it's more important to recognize kind of Pete's role in that, and then he helped popularize that, and that they kind of recognize that he kind of helped popularize it on some level as well, I think.
But there's no mention in any Louisville paper anytime during Pete's life or immediately after he died that links him to H&B. You don't see that story come up until the 1920s when Sam Severidge, who writes the Louisville Slugger annual yearbook for about 40 years, makes a story, and he adds to it each year till we get to the final story. It takes about 6 years for him to come up, and that's my reading of it. I can't tell you that was the true story or whatnot, but I can remember I gave a talk at the Slugger Museum to open the convention that was held in Louisville about 20 years ago. And Jack Hilrich was in the back. And the next day when he addressed the group, he said, the speaker last night didn't like our myth, but remember, it's our myth. And I told him after, I said, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Publicize it, whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. I just don't see the evidence. And that's where you are. Maybe something will show up somewhere.
But I think that's where I always kind of landed with this is, there's no smoking gun, so to speak. For me, there is a bit of a leap of faith, but there was definitely articles that mentioned, especially when he was in Pittsburgh, him getting bats turned by a firm and a company in Louisville. And again, there could have been other places doing it, but then there's some other articles in like 1903 that was talking about Pete and how he got these bats turned at the time. And then there's the article in 1909 that leaves him unnamed. But to me, that's where the myth story starts. But there does seem to be some connection to Pete during his lifetime to a firm in Louisville. And again, I think as I said, we can say that maybe it was another bat turning company there, but it also seems a little less likely. But I do agree there's no like smoking gun where it goes, we're going to open it up and go, oh, look at this. Here's a picture of Bud and Pete getting his bat turned. And we know that story there, And that's why I think
Also, a lot of those were out of town papers. You don't,
sure,
you don't
yeah.
see them in little papers. David Harris asks a question here. Said, do you think that he, Pete, tended to refer to himself in the third person because of his hearing problem, which led to a speech impediment? I know Bo Jackson, who had a speech impediment, had trouble with I.
I can't speak to that. I would not be surprised if there was some reason there. His hearing definitely impacted a lot of how he was and how he spoke and all those types of things. So to me, that definitely would kind of lend itself to that. The fact that he struggles to hear, he has problems with that, and it just kind of becomes this thing that he does. And the interesting with Pete is while he was this loud, kind of boisterous character, and sometimes maybe seemed like he had no idea what was going on, there also seemed to be plenty of stories that he was very aware when he would say these odd things, whether he said them intentionally or not. But after the fact, he was aware of what he said and what it may have been perceived at, but was happy to let people perceive that and not feel like he had to try and correct those things.
Also, Pete was a big drawing card. When he traveled around, the ad would say, "Here come Louisville Colonels with Pete Browning."
And there's some good stories. There's like in 1888, they left him, and he kind of said that you aren't, he flat out told him you're not going to draw without me. Like people aren't going to come, and you aren't going to play very well. And it was exactly as he said.
And Pete understood his value to the team, which you can reflect in his contract negotiation with various owners. And but he did. The mastoiditis was an indelible part of his character. It's the mastoid bone behind the ear that gets inflamed periodically, and it gives you all sorts of problems from hearing to headaches to whatnot. And the alcohol seemed to ameliorate that. Unfortunately, it also
Another
left him
thing
drunk, but Pete has time after time in the Louisville papers, they talk about him walking into the ballpark drunk and he goes 3 for 4.
Yep. Well, I think that's two interesting things with Pete there is, and this would have went for a lot of players in the year. How well would he have done if he had stayed sober, though? Maybe he would have been in so much pain he couldn't have handled that. But it also kind of speaks a little bit more to his personality a little bit, I think, which, as I said, like Pete was very confident a little bit, but he was also shy. And I think, we often look at well, what if Pete had played in the National League, or what if he had done this? But I think Pete was very happy being at home because despite this kind of loud nature, he had opportunities to go elsewhere. And I think he was happy to stay at home, even though he may have outwardly been saying, oh, I want to go here. Deep down inside, he was happy when it didn't work out, it seemed. And oftentimes when he went and when he finally did leave, there was some kind of familiar correction. I mean, Albert Johnson was in Cleveland, so there was connections already that made him maybe feel a little more comfortable because, I mean, he had opportunities, it seemed, to go, but I think he was content to stay at home. And I also don't think he viewed him being in any lesser league at the time. I don't think he viewed if I could only get to the National League and show him what I could do with it. I think he was very content and was playing professional baseball and viewed that he was good.
We have a Woody Eckert asks, with his weak fielding being partially deaf, maybe not hearing the sound of the ball off the bat hurt. He couldn't. I would guess he can't judge.
Yeah, I would think that's absolutely fair. I mean, again, I think a lot of his fielding, it's easy. We just look at the numbers and the silly stories, but when you look at things like that, I think that really puts it in perspective. He's not hearing, and it's making him very self-conscious and worried about where he's moving. So I think all that goes into building this horrible fielder that we perceive him as, though that's not entirely true, but there's some kind of other reasons that would help explain
that. Pete had another eccentricity. He didn't slide.
Yeah.
And his answer was, why won't you slide? Because he would overrun a second or third and be tagged out occasionally. But he said he didn't want to get hurt, didn't want to hurt his legs because that would take his bat out of the lineup.
Well, and I also he had some other. He once said too. One time he said, I don't want to increase my laundry bill, so why do that? And then I think my favorite is he said, I don't slide because if I'm going to get somewhere, I'm going to hit the ball far enough so that I can get there like a man. I don't need to get there sliding on my belly like somebody else. If I want to get to third, I'm going to hit the ball far enough so that I can get there standing up.
I don't know if any of the Boston folks remember the stories about Ted Williams would be in the outfield and suddenly he would take the batting stance and take a swing out there. He wasn't the world's greatest fielder either, and paying attention to that. But uh, uh, Pete was always thinking about hitting and fielding. Fielding was something he had to do, but it certainly wasn't something that he practiced like he did his batting. And he was a natural as a hitter. Just you don't hit 340, 342 for a lifetime, which is right in the same range as Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, to give you a little reference there. He had good power for the 19th century, lots of doubles. We take a look at his, even his on-base percentage, because he would take a walk occasionally.
I said, was he a good teammate? I think he generally got along with people. I mean, I mentioned he and Arlie Latham. The pallbearers at his funeral were guys that he played with back on the Eclipse team. He seemed to be very friendly with Guy Hecker. They were often roommates on the road. So I think he, for the most part, was a good teammate and got along. I don't know how much they tolerated some of his behaviors, if so to speak. There's not really a lot about that, but by my understanding of Pete and what I can see of him, he seems to be generally well liked and was fairly well popular, and had no issues. Again, I mean, the only real issue I ever found with anybody was Tony Mullane, who I don't know if anybody liked him, and Arlie Latham. So those are the only two real stories where it seemed there was a regular recurring problem.
Ken Fisher asked a question, just that you were talking about. Was Pete a good teammate? Did he keep in touch with any of his teammates after he retired?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. He seemed to be a really good teammate, and the only issues he really had with anybody seemed to be Arlie and Tony Mullane. And like I said, I don't know if anybody liked Tony Mullane, so that one doesn't really count. All the pallbearers at his funeral were kind of ex-players that he played with on the Eclipse and stuff, and he does seem to have been really good friends and stayed in touch with those guys throughout his life.
Yeah, I think a couple of them are the Rexius brothers and Chicken Wolf, because they were also friends in the same neighborhood. They all lived in a couple blocks.
Chicken Wolf had died before him,
right?
And I don't know if there's any other. Maybe one of the Rexius was a pallbearer, but the one of the Rexius brothers had died before him as well, because they had that run in the first couple of years of the 20th century where Chicken Wolf and Rexius and all them had died. So I don't know. There may have been one Rexius brother who was a pallbearer, but it was like Isaac Berklow and
Fred
Tucker may have been there.
There were three brothers.
Yes.
Phil, John, I forget the other one. Jack Seltzer writes, my grandmother in 1924 died of mastoiditis, a terrible condition. It developed after she got an ear infection after some lake swimming. My mom always said that the illness was terribly painful for her mom, this finally operated on it, but it was too late. She died after 5 awful months. Now the condition is cleared up easily with antibiotics.
Yeah, Pete had a surgery in 1884. I mean, I can't even imagine how kind of bare bones that surgery was in 1884. But he had a surgery there. He had surgeries the year he died too. But I think by that point, he was, there was a lot of things going wrong with him. But I think that speaks to, that tragic side of it. I mean, knowing how painful it was and what he was dealing with on a daily basis. And he was doing this while still getting up there and playing at a pretty high level. I think we need to kind of take that and go, wow, he was dealing with this his entire life and still playing it. That's pretty impressive.
Harvey Berger writes, did Pete get approached by other teams or managers to help either mentoring or training others coming into pro ball with batting?
No, I think Pete would have been very happy to stick around. He actually tried to get a job as an umpire, and he was kind of recognized throughout his career as being pretty like an honest person. Like despite this nature, which you would think he'd be this loud person, he was actually recognized that. But I think just Pete being Pete and who Pete was perceived as, that probably precluded a lot of people from wanting to be involved with him, even though by that point he was probably mostly sober, if not completely sober. I never like to say Pete retired, because I don't think he ever viewed himself as being done with baseball. He just never had any other opportunities. He did play some minor league ball, but nothing of consequence there. He had one time sent some letters out about how he wanted to kind of be like a substitute hitter, basically like a DH, but nobody took him up on that. And I think he would have been happy to get involved in some way to help out. But I just think that who Pete was and kind of the image of Pete kind of made people kind of not look at who he was at the time, but who he used to be. And I think that kind of stopped him from a lot of opportunities. And the last 10 years of his life or so don't seem to be overly kind of happy or so. He kind of struggles to find his place. I mean, without baseball, he didn't really seem to have a whole lot. Like I said, he never married, never had kids. So I just don't think that like he ever quite found his place. He tried a number of different things and, sold cigars and, ran for political office a couple times and, had a store and apparently worked on a riverboat, but nothing really ever stuck for him.
Jacob Kaufman writes and asks, while certainly an odd guy and a drunkard, on the other hand, asks if this is off base, it seems like that era in general embraced superstition and drinking, with there even being virtually manly associations with drinking.
Well, and I think that's kind of, like I said, like the myth of Pete, right? We can just see, and it's not just him. I mean, as you said there's a number of players that are like, we just see this drinking and where he's going up there and he went out the night before and still went 3 for 4. And I think it's easy, especially in that era, to kind of, we can just associate it with that. But I think when we step back and especially look at it through the lens of, the 21st century and what we know now about alcoholism and, alcohol abuse and things like that, it can kind of change your perception. But I can't say that there was definitely a virtuous, association with it, but there definitely was viewed a little differently. I mean, it was like, oh, Pete went out there and got his drink and he's still going to hit. So like I said, that quote really, to me, changes when you look at, how it was perceived versus what he really said.
Well, if there's nothing else, Tim, just thank you very much. It was, Browning's a fascinating guy and is forgotten. I always think he's forgotten because he died early. He was in his 50s in the early 20th century. The American Association had been gone by the time the Hall of Fame came along for decades, and the National League was still there, saying only the National League was the good guys. So there's a lot of things. Right now, there's no American Association player in the Hall of Fame. Comiskey's in there, but he wasn't there as a player.
Bid McPhee is, I think, the one American Association player.
Well, that's correct. He did, but a lot of his career was when Cincinnati was in the National League.
Yeah, I mean, he's the closest that they're going to have.
Yeah, I think you're right. But you still got Harry Stovies and folks like that out there.
Well, I think, and this is a bit of my reading of it too, is it's easy through our lens of the 20th and 21st century to look at like, oh, these guys in the American Association, if only they could have got to the National League. But I don't know if they all necessarily always all viewed that, because I mean, the National League was only a handful of years old at that point as it was. I mean, like I said, Pete had opportunities, so I don't know if he necessarily felt that like, oh, if I could have only got to the National League and shown what I could have done. Because in 1891, his first year in the National League, he still finishes third in hitting. He was on a bit of a tear going into the last month of the season and breaks his wrist. So, I mean, can we imagine if we're sitting here right now talking about 4 batting titles in 3 leagues? I mean, that's an impossibility now. But he was close to that. And, he had another couple of other years where he missed out on a batting title by a point or a couple of points, or he hits over 400 and still finishes second because Tip O'Neill goes even crazier that year and, hits whatever 427 or whatever he did. So, like, I think that it is kind of interesting to see, like, how good he was and then how much he's kind of forgotten and overlooked on some level. And, there's a number of reasons for that.
Very good. Well, thank you. Peter, if you'd like to take us to the end here.
Okay. I want to just mention that Harvey Berger had a second question that he posed that we might have missed, having to do with, I know I read the book myself too. It mentions that Pete had this extraordinary bat collection. Do you have any idea whatever happened to those bats?
I have never found anything about those bats. And one of the things that's interesting too about Pete's bat is like, he seems to have given, I'm not saying the ones in his house, but he also gave a bunch away. He famously gave one away to Honus Wagner. And so I think that like, they probably, my guess would be, they just, over time, he had no family, just ended up wherever they ended up and, got thrown out or tossed out. I don't know if Bob has ever found anything about those bats specifically, but there doesn't seem to be a lot, or there's no collection or lot that I have ever found anything about out there.
He had no will. There was no distribution of things. His mother outlived him, but my guess is, as you say, it was available for the neighborhood kids or
Yep.
friends who wanted a memento of some sort.
Well, as we said, by 1905, while Pete was still kind of remembered as a player, they'll still talk about him in the papers. It wasn't as if like he was this legendary figure and people were beating down the door to get artifacts from his life. I mean, like you said, they probably sat in the basement, his mom died, and the bats just ran where they went. Like you said, he had no family and no kids and no will, and so yeah, it's kind of interesting and sad to kind of think about all that history that is kind of gone now.
And by that time, the major league Louisville team was gone for 5-6 years. And I can remember going to the Louisville American Association team, wanted to look at their old records, and unless you had a consecutive ownership situation, they didn't keep them. Records didn't go to the next owner of the team. Some financial records would, but that was about it. Thank you again, Tim.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I just want to remind everybody here, and most of you, or some, a good portion of you, have been members of this committee for a long time. So when about 17 years ago, we're coming up on our 17th annual Overlook Legends election in June, a final election, SABR-wide election. But at the time, it was just a committee-wide election, the very first election. And Pete Browning won that election. Of all the candidates that were put up for consideration, of being overlooked by the Hall of Fame, Pete Browning was number one of all of the players. Number two was, and just by a few votes, number two was Deacon White. Several years later, Deacon White would be inducted into the Hall of Fame. And Pete Browning is sitting there still as our number one choice of year one. So it's a kind of irony, like, and you did express a lot of other people did express reasons here, maybe why. Cannot fathom it myself. Anyway, Tim, is a great job you did. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for coming.
So,
it's always more fun to have a group of faces to talk to than to talk to nobody. So thank you guys for coming and spending your night with me. I hope it was better than a Rockies game.
I was glad to see it because I couldn't see it in Cooperstown because I was in the other classroom.
The Rockies are losing, by the way.
Well, you know what? You are winning right now. So I don't know if you're going to turn the game on, but you are winning right now.
Oh, they are?
No, you're winning. You're winning.
Oh, I'm
you're
winning.
Here.
Yeah, okay.
You're winning because you're here.
I'm winning because I'm not watching the Rockies.
Exactly.
Okay, so again, thank you again, Tim. Great talk. This is Bob Bailey's project that he began 5 years ago, and this is you are the final presenter for year 5 or season 5, and we're moving in just in 48 hours. Our deadline for abstracts is coming up, and it's very strong. But please submit if you would like to. And Bob, congratulations for a grand success of 5 seasons of 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series.
Thank you.
And I guess that's it. We'll be back in September. Just in about a week and 2 days, I am doing the book presentation, the book moderation of our 19th Century Baseball Book Club on David Block's 20th anniversary edition of Baseball Before We Knew It. And it is really exciting. So I hope some of you are able to tune in. I don't think I'm just worried I'm going to give it justice. All right, everyone. Thank you again for joining in, and see you all soon, and see you at season 6 in September. Thank you.
So long, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.